The grainy black and white footage started like most security tapes do. Quiet, uneventful, timestamp blinking in the bottom corner, showing a church courtyard just after 3:00 a.m. on a Tuesday. Wind stirred the hedges near the iron gate. A moth flitted briefly across the lens. The statue stood in the center of the frame. The Virgin Mary, hands folded, eyes lowered, carved from pale stone, with a soft spotlight at her feet. For hours, nothing happened. Then at exactly 3:02 a.m. He was tall, maybe late 30s, dressed in what looked like a work shirt stained with something darker than sweat. His walk was uneven, the kind that comes from too many drinks and too little purpose. He veered sideways, caught himself against the garden wall, and cursed. Loud enough, the guards would later say, that the motion sensor mic picked it up even through the thick glass of the parish office. He turned to face the statue. For a second, he just stared. Then he shouted something unintelligible on the tape and threw a punch. The first one missed, his knuckles grazing the folds of her stone robe. The second landed squarely on the base of her arm. A dull thud echoed through the empty courtyard. He shook his hand, howled in pain, and punched again, and again, until blood showed on the side of his fist. The statue didn't crack, didn't even shift, just stood there exactly as it always had, her eyes lowered, her hands still folded in silent grace. That's when something strange happened. He stopped. Not like he passed out or fell, he just stopped moving, stood there breathing hard, blood dripping to the pavement, and stared up at her face. His own expression slowly changed, first confusion, then fear, then something closer to awe. He backed away, nearly tripping over a flower pot, and then, like a man waking from a dream, stumbled off screen. The tape ends there. The camera kept rolling, of course, but nothing else happened. Just whined, silence, and the Virgin Mary, unmoved. It was the morning shift that found the blood. The security guards, Frank and Luis, were drinking coffee in the booth when they rewound the tape. Neither of them said much after watching it. Frank just scratched his chin and muttered, "You ever see anything like that?" Luis shook his head, eyes still glued to the screen. "Nope," he said, "but I don't think he came here to vandalize." "Why's that?" Luis leaned forward and paused the tape at the exact frame where the man froze mid-breath, mid-stagger, looking straight into the face of the statue. "Because look at him," Luis whispered. "That's not a man attacking something, that's a man being stopped." Later, they'd play the tape again, and again. And no matter how many times they watched it, neither could explain what happened between the last punch and the way that man stood still, like someone else was there, invisible but undeniable. They didn't know who he was at first. The church courtyard didn't have facial recognition, and he didn't leave anything behind. No wallet, no ID, not even a hat to lift for prints. Just a streak of blood on the concrete and a ghost in the system. Frank called the local precinct, described the incident as a potential vandalism case, and asked if they had anyone in the drunk tank matching the description. No one did. No arrests that night. No disturbance calls in the area. No matches. The next morning, Father Darius, pastor of St. Elizabeth for over 15 years, was shown the footage. He watched it in silence, arms folded, jaw set in a way that made the lines in his face seem deeper. When the man struck the statue, the priest didn't flinch. But when he stopped and stared at her, when his whole body seemed to pause in some invisible grip, Father Darius narrowed his eyes and leaned in. "Find him," he said. Just that. No fire and brimstone. No lecture about sacrilege. Just those two words. Find him. The parish tried, in their own quiet ways. The local coffee shop kept an eye out. The soup kitchen made copies of the man's blurry still frame from the video and passed them discreetly to volunteers. But nobody recognized him. Not even the homeless who slept under the viaducts or the bartenders who saw every kind of man pass through after dark. For a while, it was like he'd vanished. But then came dawn. 5 days after the incident, on a Sunday morning so early the sky hadn't yet turned blue, the church doors creaked open. The guards had just finished their shift and were sipping weak coffee in the back office. The first person to see him wasn't a priest or a nun, but the janitor, an old Navy vet named Curtis, who unlocked the chapel every morning at 6. The man was already there, kneeling. Curtis stopped in the doorway, broom in hand. He recognized the blood-stained shirt immediately, though it had been washed and mended. The tear near the collar still showed. The man knelt on the marble floor, with his head bowed low, hands shaking, lips moving. Not the empty mutterings of a drunk. Curtis had seen that plenty. This was something else. A whisper. A prayer. A man speaking to something he didn't understand but knew was listening. Curtis backed out slowly, closed the chapel door, and walked to the office without a word. When Frank looked up from his coffee, Curtis just said, "He's here." They didn't disturb him. Not at first. He stayed there, knees pressed into the cold floor, for over an hour. At 7:15 a.m., he stood, crossed himself imperfectly, like someone who hadn't done it in years, and walked out into the street without looking back. Still no name. Still no answers. But now the story had changed. He didn't come back to the statue in rage. He came back in silence, and he came to pray. It was the bartender who first recognized him, not from the news, not from the church, but from the quiet way he used to drink. He was a regular, but not the talkative kind. Mickey O'Malley told Frank when he stopped by to ask questions. Came in maybe twice a week, sat near the back, same booth every time. Whiskey neat, didn't start fights, didn't make friends. Just drank like it was medicine and stared at nothing. That final night was different. He came in later than usual around midnight and looked worse than Mickey had ever seen him. Pale, wet from the rain, shirt sticking to his back like he'd run through half the city. He ordered 3 shots in a row, paid in cash, and didn't speak a word. Just sat there, hunched over, knuckles white around the glass. By the 4th shot, Mickey noticed the tremble. Not from the alcohol, but something underneath it, rage or grief. Maybe both. There was one other customer in the bar that night, an old guy named Ron, who sat by the jukebox and pretended to be picking songs when he was really just listening to other people's pain. He didn't say anything, but later he told Mickey, that man looked like he'd either just lost everything or just realized he never had it to begin with. After the 5th drink, the man finally spoke. Quiet, like he was talking to himself more than anyone else. She watched. Mickey leaned over. Sorry, buddy, what was that? He didn't answer. Just looked up, eyes bloodshot and wild. She saw everything. She didn't stop it. Mickey didn't ask who she was. You learn in this business that some questions open doors you don't want to walk through. The man stood up suddenly, knocking the glass to the floor. It didn't shatter, just rolled under the stool, forgotten. He left without paying for the last drink, and Mickey didn't chase him. Something about the way he moved, deliberate, almost rehearsed, told him the night was far from over. The next time Mickey saw him was on the news, in a still frame pulled from the church's security feed. The headline didn't name him, just called him the Vandal. Mickey didn't correct it, but that night stayed with him, haunted him even more than the footage of the statue attack. Because something about that last moment, the way the man looked back at the bar before stepping into the street, had a weight to it. Like he wasn't just leaving a building, but shedding the last piece of himself. He didn't punch her out of hate, Mickey would later say, almost to himself. He punched her because he thought she let him down. And somehow, that was worse. Because what do you do with a man who's already lost his faith, and then decides to pick a fight with the only thing left that might still love him? It wasn't there before, not in the photos from last week's wedding, not in the Easter bulletin, not in any of the dozens of tourist snapshots pinned to the church's corkboard. But 2 days after the man's outburst, just beneath the Virgin's folded hands, a thin, jagged line had appeared in the marble. It was small, no longer than a fingernail, but unmistakable. A crack, pale, hairline, sharp. The kind of detail no one would notice unless they were looking for it, but once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. Father Darius noticed it first, standing at the base of the statue before sunrise, as he did every Wednesday. He always came alone, coffee in hand, to pray in silence before the day began. He wasn't a man prone to hysteria, nor was he sentimental about objects. Statues could chip, rain could erode, but something about this one stopped him cold. The crack hadn't been carved. It hadn't weathered. It looked like stress, like something inside the stone had shifted. He reached out instinctively, fingertips grazing the edge. The marble was cold, too cold, even for that hour. The rest of the statue was its usual temperature, but the crack, it bit like ice. Darius stepped back, unsettled, and for the first time in years, found himself unable to pray. Later that morning, maintenance came to inspect it. They logged the crack in their report, took photographs, and filed a standard damage form. Nothing urgent, they said. Probably cosmetic, maybe a pressure fracture. But one of the workers, a young guy named Manny, lingered longer than the others. He didn't touch it, didn't speak, just stared. When asked about it later, Manny simply said, It's in the shape of a vein, like something's trying to bleed through. Word spread quickly, as it always does in quiet places with long histories. Some parishioners believed the crack was a sign divine, prophetic, maybe even a warning. Others dismissed it as coincidence. "Stone's old," one of the older men said. "Stuff breaks. Don't need angels for that." But even he avoided looking too long at the statue afterward. What no one said aloud, at least not right away, was what a few of them were already thinking. The crack showed up after he hit her. Not before. Not over decades of weather or vandalism or earthquakes, but after one man, a broken, angry, drunk man, raised his hand in violence, and somehow the marble remembered. The statue didn't crumble. It didn't fall. But something had changed, subtly, quietly. No one tried to fix it, not because they didn't have the tools or the know-how, but because deep down, they were afraid of what might happen if they did, as if the Virgin herself had chosen to keep the scar, and in doing so told them this wasn't over yet. Frank and Luis had watched a lot of strange things from behind the security booth's glass midnight break-ins, teenagers sneaking kisses by the fountain, even the occasional fox wandering across the courtyard like it owned the place. But nothing stayed with them the way that man did. After reviewing the footage, they agreed to file the report and then forget it. At least that was the plan. But forgetting something doesn't mean it leaves you alone. It was the silence afterward that made it hard. The kind that follows you out to your car, wraps around your steering wheel, rides with you home. Frank would wake at 3:00 a.m., eyes dry, mouth open, unsure why. Luis said the dream started 3 days later. But this time, the man never punched. He just stared at her, whispered something Luis couldn't quite hear, and then turned around with tears running down his face. Every night, same dream, same timestamp in the corner. 3:02. Neither of them told anyone at first. What would they say? The drunk guy we watched try to punch the Mother of God is now haunting our REM cycles? They weren't exactly saints themselves. They'd both seen rough days, long nights, things you carry like an old injury. But this was different. This one felt like it had a weight to it, like it wanted to be remembered. Luis started sitting outside the booth more often, just on the edge of the courtyard where he could see the statue from the side. He said it helped. "I don't know, man," he told Frank one night. "She don't look mad, not even sad, just waiting, like she's giving him time." Frank didn't respond. He was starting to think the same thing. Every time he looked at the statue now, he noticed something new. A tilt in the head, a softness in the eyes. It was marble, he knew that. Unmoving, lifeless. But it didn't feel lifeless. Not anymore. One night, Luis returned from patrol with a strange look on his face. "She was humming," he said. Frank frowned. "What?" The statue. "I swear to you, for like 3 seconds I heard humming, like a lullaby. Soft, just above the wind." They checked the footage. Nothing. No sound, no interference, no wind spike. Just video of Luis standing beside the statue, still as stone. They stopped bringing it up after that. Not because they didn't believe each other, but because they both did. Sometimes silence isn't denial, it's reverence. In the booth, they started playing old hymns again, just low enough to blend with the hum of the monitors. They opened their shift with a prayer, not because it was required, but because it felt right. And each night, as the clock neared 3:02 a.m., they'd glance at the monitor, and no matter how tired or cynical or confused they felt, they both said the same thing under their breath. Be gentle with him. It was just after 6:00 a.m. when the man returned. This time, no one saw him stumble. No blood on his hands, no shouting. He entered through the front gate quietly, like he belonged there, though he'd never been seen in daylight before. His shirt was clean, his face shaved, and for the first time, his eyes looked clear, tired, yes, but clear. And there was something in the way he walked now, slower, deliberate, like a man approaching something he'd feared and hoped for all at once. Luis spotted him first from the booth. "He's back," he said, nudging Frank without taking his eyes off the screen. Frank stood beside him, squinting at the monitor. "No bottle this time," he murmured. "And look at his hands. They're open." The man walked straight to the statue. Not the steps, not the bench, right to her feet. He didn't kneel this time. He stood, head tilted up, looking into the Virgin's eyes. And then he spoke. Not loudly, not with drama. Just a whisper, lips moving slowly, syllables shaped by sorrow and something deeper. Frank reached to unmute the feed, but there was no sound. The microphone flickered, struggled, then went dead. Static. When it came back 10 seconds later, the man's mouth had stopped moving. Then he knelt. Not like the first time, when he had collapsed in pain and exhaustion. This was something different, reverent, steady. A man kneeling not to beg but to surrender. And he stayed there. 10 minutes passed, then 15. The courtyard began to wake early risers with their coffee, a nun crossing from the rectory. No one disturbed him. They watched from a respectful distance, something about his stillness making it clear that this wasn't the kind of moment to interrupt. When he finally rose, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a single item, a folded piece of paper. He knelt again, placed it gently at the statue's base, and pressed his hand to the crack that ran beneath her folded hands. Then he turned and walked away. Didn't look back. Didn't linger. Just left. The guards waited a minute, maybe two, before approaching. Frank was the one who picked up the paper. He held it with the kind of care usually reserved for scripture. It was folded twice, worn at the edges, no name, just one line handwritten in shaky print. "I'm sorry I blamed you for what happened to her." Neither man said a word. Luis reached up and crossed himself. Frank placed the note in a plastic sleeve, locked it in the parish office drawer, and didn't speak of it to anyone for days. But that note changed something. Not just for the man, but for the people who'd been watching. The anger was gone now. And in its place, there was the beginning of a story no one had expected. Not of judgment, but of return. Curtis had been working at St. Elizabeth's for almost 12 years, and in that time, he'd seen all kinds of messes: spilled candle wax, shattered stained glass during a storm, even a squirrel infestation in the sacristy ceiling. But none of it stayed with him the way that man did. Not just because of what he did to the statue, but because of what Curtis saw the morning after and what he didn't say. Until now. He hadn't planned on telling anyone. Janitors don't usually get asked for their thoughts on miracles. They're expected to mop the floors, keep the lights working, and stay out of the way. But something had been eating at him since that Sunday. And when Father Darius found him sitting quietly on the back pew with a mop still dripping beside him, Curtis finally spoke. "I lied, Father," he said. "I said he was already kneeling when I found him, that I walked in and saw him praying." Father Darius raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Just waited. Curtis looked down at his hands. That's not what happened. He wasn't kneeling. He was lying flat on his back, like he'd been knocked out. I thought maybe he'd had a seizure. I ran over to check if he was breathing. He was. His eyes were wide open. But the look on his face, he swallowed. He looked like he'd seen heaven. Or maybe judgment. There was a long silence between them. When I touched his shoulder to shake him awake, Curtis continued, his skin was cold. But the marble floor, the floor where he lay, it was warm. Father Darius's face didn't change. He just nodded slightly, as if confirming something he had already suspected. "Why didn't you say anything before?" he asked gently. Curtis gave a sad, crooked smile. "Because I didn't want anyone to think I was crazy. I've mopped that chapel for over a decade. I know every tile, every creak in the pews. But that morning, Father, something had shifted. The air was different. Thicker, like something sacred had just passed through, and I'd walked in too late to see it." Later that day, Father Darius mentioned the conversation only once to Luis, in passing. Curtis saw him lying down, not kneeling. Luis frowned. "You think he collapsed?" "I think," the priest replied slowly. "He was laid down." Word of the confession didn't spread far. Most people never heard it. But for those who did, it changed how they saw everything that came after. Because if the man hadn't walked into the chapel to kneel but had been found lying there, eyes wide, floor warm beneath him, then maybe he hadn't come to pray. Maybe he'd been answered first. And whatever met him there, whether grace or judgment, left something behind in its place. Something that couldn't be mopped away. Something that still lingered in the chapel air, like the faint scent of incense long after the last candle had burned out. It took a week for the story to make the news. And when it did, it was wrong in all the ways that matter. A local paper ran the headline, "Vandal Targets Historic Statue, Prompting Debate on Church Security." Below it was a blurry still from the security footage, just the moment when the man raised his fist, mid-motion, face half in shadow. No mention of what happened afterward, no mention of the return visit, Just one angry swing frozen in time, stripped of context, painted as malice. It made the man a symbol of rising crime, of spiritual decline, of everything the editorials wanted to lament that week. Commenters online had their say. Another lost soul lashing out at what he doesn't understand. Should have been arrested. They need better locks. No one asked why a man would punch a statue of the Virgin Mary at 3 in the morning, or what kind of story that kind of rage might be hiding. And no one reported what happened the next day when parishioners arrived to find a small bouquet of white lilies at the base of the statue, with a note that read only, "For the one she remembers." Those closest to the church, Frank, Luis, Curtis, Father Darius, they all agreed not to speak to the press. Not because they were covering anything up, but because they knew the story was still unfolding, and the truth couldn't be squeezed into a headline. Mickey O'Malley saw the article in the paper left behind in his bar. He read it once, frowned, and flipped it over. "That's not the man I served," he said aloud to no one. "That's a shadow of him. And shadows can lie." But the damage had already been done. People began visiting the courtyard not for peace or prayer, but for spectacle. Someone posted the footage online with dramatic music and red circles around the man's face. The video got 30,000 views in 2 days. Teenagers came to take selfies beside the statue. One even mimicked the punch, pretending to freeze in the same pose for laughs. That's when something strange began to happen. The photos didn't come out right. Cell phone shots of the statue appeared blurred or tinted with a strange blue hue that didn't match the lighting. One image showed a flare of light behind the statue's head like a crown, though the sun hadn't risen yet. A digital camera's lens cracked without impact. A tourist swore his phone froze completely as soon as he stepped onto the courtyard path. Within a week, the visits stopped. Not because anyone told them to. Not because of threats or warnings, but because something in the air shifted something unspoken, like a presence that had grown tired of being turned into a sideshow. And while the world outside argued about security and vandalism, those inside the parish began to understand what the man had shown them. This wasn't a story meant to be reported. It was a story meant to be felt. The morning after the news story ran, the sun rose soft and golden over the courtyard, lighting the statue in the same way it had every day for decades. But something was different. Curtis saw it first as he swept the stone walkway leading up to the Virgin Mary. He wasn't looking for anything, just doing his rounds, half awake, coffee still warm in the thermos beside him. But as the light shifted, he paused. There, just beneath her right arm, was a faint shape in the marble. Not a shadow, not a stain, a mark. He stepped closer, dropped to one knee, and squinted. It was a handprint. Not carved, not painted, just there, pressed faintly into the stone like a memory. 5 fingers splayed, slightly off-center, not dramatic, not glowing, just impossibly real. As if someone had touched the statue with such force and desperation that the stone itself had remembered it. He reached out, hesitated, then laid his own hand gently over it. The fit was wrong, his fingers too broad, palm too wide. It didn't match, but the marble beneath his skin was warm, not sun-warmed, not surface level, warm like something lived underneath it. Curtis stood and backed away, crossing himself before turning to find Father Darius. The priest listened, followed, and stood beside him in silence as they looked at the mark together. "It's not dirt," Curtis said softly. "I tried rubbing it with my sleeve. Nothing came off." Father Darius didn't speak. He stepped forward, placed his own hand against the shape, and closed his eyes. The wind rustled through the leaves above them. In the distance, church bells rang from another parish, far off in the city. The priest opened his eyes. "Don't touch it again," he said gently. "Just leave it." By noon, half the parish staff had seen it. By evening, word had reached the regulars, the ones who lit candles every Friday, who brought fresh lilies, who knew the statue better than they knew most people. They all visited quietly, in ones and twos. No crowds, no photos. They simply stood, stared, and walked away with something heavier or lighter in their steps. Some said it was the man's hand. Others believed it was hers, that in the moment of impact, the Virgin had raised her hand, not in defense, but in compassion. That what remained was her touch pressed into the moment of his collapse. And some thought the print wasn't from this world at all. That it was a mark left behind by whatever had passed through the chapel that night when the man had lain flat on the marble floor. Theories grew, but no one tried to explain it too loudly, because something about that print demanded quiet, like it had been left there not as a sign to provoke, but as a promise not to be forgotten. It faded by the end of the week, barely visible by Sunday. But those who saw it knew it had been real. And somehow, that was enough. They never called themselves a group. There were no meetings, no flyers, no official invitation. They just began showing up one by one, night after night, as if drawn by something they couldn't name. It started with Mrs. Harrow, a widow in her 70s who lived 3 blocks from the church. She came with a folding chair and a thermos of tea, setting herself just outside the courtyard gates. Said she couldn't sleep. Said it helped to be near the statue after sundown. Then came Lenny, the high school custodian who usually kept to himself. He never brought a chair, just leaned against the iron fence, watching the marble glow under the lamplight. "Don't know why," he'd say when asked. "Just feels like I should be here." By the end of the second week, there were 6 of them, then 10, then more. They never stayed long. Some came for 5 minutes, others for an hour. Most didn't speak. Those who did spoke quietly, in low murmurs or whispered prayers. A candle would appear, then another. People brought roses, rosaries, even a few small drawings from children tucked into the cracks of the stone steps. No one coordinated it. It just happened. The parish didn't stop them. In fact, Father Darius began leaving the courtyard lights on later than usual. Curtis started placing extra folding chairs near the fence, just in case. And Frank and Luis, who once found the nighttime shifts tedious, now looked forward to the quiet rhythm of those visits. There was something deeply peaceful in watching people return to a place they didn't fully understand, simply because their soul asked them to. One night, a woman came with a guitar. She didn't play anything loud or showy, just a few soft chords of a Marian hymn. Someone else hummed along. Another began to cry, quietly, like she hadn't meant to. No one turned to look. They just let her. These midnight watchers never spoke of the man, not directly, but his presence was felt in the silence, in the way people stared a little longer at the base of the statue, in the way they knelt with hands open, rather than clasped, as if they, too, were offering up something they didn't know how to say. What made it stranger, what made it beautiful, was how these visits changed people. The gruff man from the deli began smiling more. A woman who hadn't spoken to her estranged sister in 3 years left the courtyard one night and made the call. Even Luis, who had once said church was just marble and memory, started pausing his rounds to pray quietly before the statue. No thunder, no visions, just stillness. And in that stillness, something was shifting, not in the statue, but in the hearts of the people watching it. Something was softening, healing, beginning again, and though no one said his name, they all knew the truth. Whatever brought that man back had started to bring them back too. No one saw her arrive, but everyone noticed her standing there. She wore a red scarf wrapped loosely around her head, the kind older women sometimes wear in winter, though the weather that evening was mild. Her coat was long, dark blue, buttoned neatly to the collar. She stood beside the statue, not at the base like most did, but just off to the side, where the shadow of the Virgin Mary fell soft across the stone path. She didn't kneel. She didn't pray aloud. She just stood with her hands folded in front of her, and her eyes locked on the statue's face, unmoving. Curtis was sweeping the upper walk when he spotted her. He thought she might be a nun at first, maybe from another parish. But as he approached, he noticed her shoes worn, ordinary, scuffed from miles of walking, not church shoes, not polished. He offered a quiet nod as he passed. She returned it, barely, and though she said nothing, Curtis felt the kind of presence that made him stop a few steps later and glance back. She hadn't moved. Others noticed her too. Luis watched from the booth and radioed Frank. "We've got a new one tonight." Frank glanced at the monitor. "She trouble?" "No," Luis said, watching the screen as if trying to decide something. "She's still, but not like the others. Like she's been waiting a long time to be here." She stayed for nearly 2 hours. People came and went. Some whispered prayers, others lit candles. But the woman in the red scarf didn't move. Not until the bells from a nearby clock tower struck 10. Then she reached into her coat pocket, pulled out a tiny object wrapped in tissue, and knelt. Frank stepped out of the booth to see her more clearly. From where he stood, he could just make out what she was placing on the pedestal. A locket, small, gold. She kissed it once, placed it beneath the crack in the marble, and whispered a few words too soft to hear. Then she stood, and for the first time that evening, she turned to look at the statue, not with reverence, not with fear, but with a kind of quiet, broken gratitude. Her eyes brimmed with something ancient, not fresh grief, something deeper. a grief that had had time to settle into the soul. As she walked away, she passed Curtis once more. This time she paused. "He didn't mean to," she said softly. Curtis blinked. "Ma'am?" She looked at him, and her eyes were sharp now. Clear. "My son. He didn't mean to do it. He just didn't know where else to put the pain." She said nothing more. Just walked down the path, red scarf trailing behind her in the breeze. Curtis stood there long after she vanished into the dark, the words echoing in his chest. So now they knew. The man wasn't just some stranger. He was someone's son. And he wasn't running. He was returning. Before the statue ever became a local legend, before the courtyard filled with lilies and candles and whispered prayers, it was just a patch of dirt behind the church. Overgrown, neglected, forgotten. And the only person who ever really tended it was Marco Alvarez, the church's part-time gardener. Retired now, but still stopping by twice a week, mostly out of habit. Marco didn't speak much. He was a man of soil and silence, the kind who found God more in pruning shears than in sermons. He'd been caring for the gardens surrounding the statue for almost 20 years. Roses, marigolds, ivy that grew too fast. He was the one who planted the white jasmine that now framed the Virgin Mary like a soft crown. "Beauty honors beauty," he always said, usually to himself. But since the night of the punch, Marco had become quieter. Slower in his work. He didn't hum like he used to. Didn't speak to the blooms under his breath. Curtis asked once if he was feeling okay. Marco just nodded, then looked up at the statue and said, "She felt it." When the handprint appeared, he was one of the first to see it. He didn't touch it. Didn't get close. He just placed a single pot of white lilies beside it and walked away. But it was something Marco said 2 weeks later that began to shift the conversation inside the parish office. He came in from the courtyard one morning, hands dusty, eyes unreadable, and laid an envelope on Father Darius's desk. "This is from the soil," he said. Inside was a photograph, taken by Marco's old Polaroid, the kind with faded corners and light leaks. It showed the base of the statue. Not the handprint, but something else. In the flower bed directly beneath the Virgin's feet, there was a strange blooming pattern. No one had planted them that way. Marco swore on it. He knew every root, every bulb, every inch of that earth. "I didn't do this," he said, and neither did the wind. They brought in a horticulturist from the nearby university. She examined the bed, the bloom cycle, the spacing. Her report used terms like natural spread anomaly and environmental mimicry, but she couldn't explain why only those 5 bloomed, or why they were so perfectly curved, or why the soil beneath them was warmer than the rest of the flower bed. "Maybe the light hits it differently," she offered with a shrug. But there was no extra light, no heat lamp, just sunlight. And whatever warmth lived beneath that soil, it hadn't come from above. It had come from something else. Marco stood by the door as they discussed it. When they asked if he had anything more to add, he simply said, "Pain leaves an imprint, but so does mercy." And with that, he left, returning to the garden that somehow had started blooming prayers. Father Darius had been many things in his life. Teacher, counselor, reluctant handyman, but never, in all his years of ministry, had he felt so unsure of what to say. Not because he didn't believe something was happening. He did. From the moment he saw the man return, from the warmth in the marble, from the quiet bloom of lilies he knew. But knowing something holy is stirring, and speaking of it, are 2 different things. And the older he got, the more he feared words could ruin what silence holds sacred. He'd been with the parish long enough to know how stories twist when passed from tongue to tongue, how miracles become marketing, how mystery turns into spectacle. So he chose restraint. He did not preach about the statue from the pulpit. He didn't organize press conferences or release statements to the diocese. He didn't even mention the handprint in the weekly bulletin. Instead, he watched and waited. It wasn't apathy. It was reverence. Behind closed doors, people began asking for his opinion. Was the statue bleeding? Was the garden a sign? Did he believe the man had been changed? To each question, he gave the same reply. "Some things aren't for us to explain, only to receive." Not everyone appreciated his quiet. Some parishioners, especially the newcomers, wanted clarity, proof, a declaration. But Father Darius remembered what the saints often said, that true miracles rarely announce themselves. They arrive in whispers, in the folding of hands, in a man collapsing at the feet of the Mother of God, not in defiance, but in defeat. And if you listened long enough, The silence around those moments would speak louder than any sermon. He did, however, begin one habit. Each evening, after the courtyard emptied and the last candle flickered to its end, he would walk alone to the statue. No fanfare. Just his steps on the stone path, and the weight of something divine pressing soft on his shoulders. He never brought a prayer written in advance. Instead, he simply stood there, eyes on the Virgin's face, and let the words come. Some nights, he said nothing at all, just stood there, like everyone else, waiting to be heard. Once, Louise caught a glimpse of him from the booth. The priest had his hand pressed to the crack in the marble, his head bowed not with sorrow, but with something like awe. Later that night, Louise told Frank, "I think he knows more than he's saying." Frank nodded. "I think he's trying to protect it, whatever it is." And maybe he was. Not because the miracle was fragile, but because it was too alive to be handled carelessly. Because deep down, Father Darius believed what few dared to say out loud, that heaven sometimes visits the broken in small places. And when it does, the holiest thing you can do is listen. The recording wasn't meant to be special, just routine. It hadn't worked right since the last storm, too much static, muffled audio, timestamp glitches. But that night, after the last visitor had left and the courtyard fell still, he ran a 30-minute check and let the system record. He forgot about it. The next morning, when reviewing the file to check the sync, he nearly skipped ahead. But something about the waveform caught his eye. A swell. A spike in volume near the middle of the clip. He tapped play. For the first 12 minutes, nothing. The low rustle of wind, the hum of the nearby street lamp. Then at exactly 3:33 a.m. came three soft tones. Not chimes, not bells, not mechanical, just three slow resonant hums, like a deep voice singing a lullaby into the bones of the earth. Luis leaned forward, replayed it. They didn't sound like any tone he'd ever heard before. Too perfect, too alive. There was no bell scheduled to ring. The church tower had been silent for 2 years, and the parish didn't play any pre-programmed sound after midnight. The tones weren't even on the usual frequency. They came through as if from somewhere else, filtered, ethereal, almost ancient. He called Frank in. "Listen to this," he said, and hit play. Frank's expression changed by the second tone. By the third, he was already crossing himself. "What is it?" Luis asked. Frank didn't answer right away. He just stared at the screen like something had cracked in the walls of what he thought he believed. They brought the clip to Father Darius. He listened once, closed his eyes, and asked only, "Has it happened again?" Luis checked the logs. Same tones, same time. 3 nights in a row, always at 3:33. Never earlier, never later. He tried pulling the raw data, filtering out background noise, slowing it down, speeding it up. Each attempt only made the tones sound more human, more layered. Like there were voices behind them. Not words, just presence. The strangest part? The audio only played in the booth. When exported to other devices, it was gone. Replaced by static, Father Darius decided to leave it alone. "If something wants to be heard," he said, "it will speak again, in its own way." Still, Luis kept a copy on the console. He didn't play it often, but on quiet nights, when the courtyard felt heavy with something unseen, he'd sit in the dark, fingers hovering above the playback button, and whisper, "If this is you, we're still listening." And mattered hours, because even the guards now believed it wasn't just marble and silence anymore. The statue had become a place where heaven touched the earth. And somehow, now it was singing. He hadn't come back to the statue in a week. Not since the woman in the red scarf. Not since the lilies bloomed in the shape of a hand. And for a while, it seemed like his part in the story was over. Until a nurse at Mercy General called the parish in the middle of the night, asking for a priest. "He's not dying," she said, "but he's different. I think he needs someone." The man had been brought into the ER 2 hours earlier, collapsed at a bus stop downtown. No ID. He'd refused a stretcher, walked himself to the intake window, and calmly said, "I think I'm supposed to rest now." They placed him in observation, room 314, gave him fluids, and checked his heart. Everything was normal, almost too normal, the nurse said, like his body had been wiped clean of stress. No elevated cortisol, no dehydration, no injury, just exhaustion. Like a man who'd carried something too heavy for too long and finally laid it down. Father Darius arrived just after 2:00 a.m. Collar crooked from being hastily thrown on, hair tousled, eyes clear. He didn't need directions. The nurse on duty, Megan, mid-30s, mother of two, not particularly religious, watched him walk straight to room 314 as if he'd been there before. She followed. What she heard, she would later write down in her journal, not because she wanted to remember, but because she was afraid she might forget. The man sat upright in bed, arms folded over a hospital blanket, eyes turned to the window, though it was nothing but black glass. He didn't seem surprised to see Father Darius. Just said, "I was asked," the priest replied gently. The man nodded. "Good. I don't know how to explain it. I don't think I'm supposed to." "Try," the priest said, and then came the words Megan would never forget. "She didn't stop me because I needed to fall," he said. "I had to hit something sacred to realize I still felt pain. And that meant I wasn't gone yet, that I could still come back." He looked at his hands then, palms up, as if seeing them for the first time. "When I touched her, I felt warmth. Not like fire, not even like flesh, like memory. As if the stone remembered everyone who had ever prayed there and decided I was worth remembering too." He paused. "She didn't punish me. She waited." That was when Megan stepped back, tears pricking at her eyes for reasons she couldn't explain. Before Father Darius left, he placed a small wooden rosary in the man's hands. The man looked down at it and said, "I don't know if I believe in all of it yet." Father Darius smiled. "She already believes in you." And with that, the room went quiet again. The kind of quiet that feels holy. They didn't plan to gather. No announcement, no flyer taped to the chapel doors. But as the days passed, whispers moved through the pews and down the side streets, soft as wind. Something's happening again. And by the time the clock ticked toward 3, that Friday morning, more than 24 people stood quietly at the edge of the courtyard, some in coats and scarves, others with coffee thermoses and candles, all eyes fixed on the Virgin. Luis and Frank watched from the booth, neither speaking. They'd both felt it too, that faint pressure in the air, like the sky itself was holding its breath. Every security feed had been cleared for storage space that morning. Every mic tested, every wire checked. Nothing was wrong. And yet every screen flickered. Then the gate creaked open. It was him, the man, no longer limping, no longer hunched, dressed in a simple gray jacket, his hands bare, eyes focused. Not heavy like before, but full, like a man who'd walked through fire and come out carrying water. He didn't go straight to the statue. He walked the courtyard slowly, as if retracing his steps. The spot where he once collapsed. The base where the crack in the marble had formed. The path where candles had been left by people he'd never met. Then, without a word, he stepped forward and knelt. The moment he touched the stone, 3:33 a.m. Only this time, the tones were different. Still 3 notes. Still low. Still full of something that felt older than sound itself. But layered now, like voices joined in harmony. Some swore they heard strings. Others swore they heard weeping. The sound didn't come from any speaker. It came from the air, from the ground, from somewhere just beyond the veil. Curtis, who'd come without being told, dropped his broom and fell to his knees. The woman from the red scarf was there too, near the rear of the crowd, her scarf tucked into her coat, her hand over her heart. And though no one could say why, every person there began to pray, not because they were told to, but because it felt like the only thing they could do. And the statue, she didn't move, of course. But for a brief second, those who dared to look into her eyes claimed they saw something new in them. A shine, a light, not reflected, not from the courtyard lamps, from within. And then it was over. No thunder, no lightning, no voice from the heavens, just stillness. The man stood, bowed his head and whispered something too soft for any mic to catch. Then he turned and walked away through the same gate he had entered. He never came back after that. But those who were there that night would remember the time, the light, the harmony that lived inside silence. And they would say, from then on, that the statue didn't just forgive, she healed. It was 2 months later when the man was seen again, this time not in the courtyard, not under the glow of a security camera or framed by whispers in the dark. He was seen walking down Maple Street in the late afternoon, grocery bag in one hand, a dog leash in the other. Clean-shaven, hair trimmed, eyes calm, a golden retriever trotted beside him, tail wagging. The deli owner, Sal, was the first to recognize him. He didn't say anything, just watched through the glass as the man helped an elderly woman cross the street and offered a gentle nod to a pair of teens sitting on the church steps. The man didn't act like someone famous. He didn't walk like someone known. Curtis ran into him the next day, near the community garden behind the school. They stood face to face for the first time without a chapel between them. "You're looking well," Curtis said, leaning on his rake. The man nodded. "I'm trying." Curtis glanced at the ground. "People still talk about it, you know." "I know. They don't say your name. Some don't even know it." "That's okay." Curtis looked up. "Sure. What did you feel that night?" The man paused, thought, then answered slowly, like unwrapping a fragile memory. "I felt seen. Not like someone was watching me. Like someone had always been watching. Even when I didn't deserve it." He smiled, small and sincere. "She didn't look away. Even when I did the worst thing I've ever done." Curtis swallowed hard and said nothing. Later that same day, the man visited O'Malley's bar but not to drink. He sat at the counter with a glass of water, ordered a sandwich, and thanked Mickey for the kindness he never showed outwardly but always gave quietly. "Mind if I leave something here?" the man asked, sliding a small card across the counter. On it, handwritten, were just 3 words: "I made it." Mickey didn't ask what it meant, just nodded and slipped the card into the register, where he kept the things too strange to throw away. And over the next few weeks, the man settled into the fabric of the town like he'd always belonged, volunteering at the shelter, helping kids with homework at the library, talking softly with veterans on park benches without ever using words like miracle or statue or second chance. He never told his full story, never gave an interview, never claimed he'd been changed. He simply lived like someone who no longer had to run from himself. And while people guessed and whispered and quietly pieced the puzzle together, no one tried to corner him with questions. Because they could all see what mattered most. The man who once raised his fist at a statue now raised his hand in peace. The statue never moved. No fire burst from the heavens. No angel descended in a flood of gold. And there was no headline in the national papers that said, "Miracle confirmed." It stayed where it always had, arms open, eyes lowered, silent against the wind. And yet, ask anyone who was there, who watched what unfolded in those long weeks after the man's first return, and they'll tell you the same thing. Something happened. Something holy. But the miracle, they'll say, wasn't in the marble. It was in what came after. The town changed, but quietly. People started greeting each other again at the bakery. Strangers offered rides. Candles stayed lit longer in the chapel, often left by people no one could name. Even Frank, who once claimed his faith stopped with a paycheck, now kept a rosary in his glove compartment. Luis stopped cursing under his breath and began closing every shift with a soft "thank you" to the empty air. Curtis retired that spring, but every first Friday, he returned to sweep the path up to the statue with a fresh broom, never because it needed cleaning, but because it felt like an offering. The woman in the red scarf was seen again too once, just before Easter, walking quietly along the outer garden wall. She didn't stop. She didn't speak. But she paused long enough to touch the jasmine vines Marco had planted and smile, as if she'd heard something in the silence no one else could. As for Marco, he no longer questioned the lilies. He just kept tending to them, kept planting in quiet faith, like the ground itself had decided what would grow there. And he was just lucky enough to help it bloom. And the man? He was simply part of things now. No grand gesture, no pulpit testimony, just another face in the crowd, sometimes at the evening service, sometimes volunteering at the soup kitchen, sometimes walking his dog past the chapel, pausing just long enough to look toward the statue with a softness in his eyes. Some still asked what changed him. Some still wanted proof, but most stopped needing answers because they saw it in his face, in his walk, in the way he spoke slower now, like each word had been carried through fire and came out purified. And slowly, the town came to understand. The miracle wasn't that the statue survived a man's rage. It was that the man survived his own. That someone stood in the path of his self-destruction and didn't stop him with force, but with presence, with mercy. That was the real miracle. Not that marble cracked or bells tolled or lilies bloomed out of season, but that a wounded, angry soul lifted a hand to strike God and was embraced instead. So if you ever pass through that quiet courtyard and see a glint of white stone in the sun, stop. You don't need to believe in miracles to stand still for one. You just need to listen.